Thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and I'm most pleased to have been invited. I thank you, Margaret, for having extended that invitation, and I hope I might have a few little nuggets of that might capture your interest for the day. Margaret seemed to cover immediately the title, and that is The History That You Were Never Told. And that was added to Capital Chronicles quite simply because in my journey through history, local history, what I found is that our local history is not well captured in any large picture. It's always in very small capsules, usually very local. And it's history societies such as your own that encapsulate the history that is local. And of course, because all of the historical societies are working sometimes in a silo, the histories are not joined. And there are nuggets of the history from one locality that actually seriously affect and seriously have an impact on how the history should be told. So it's been my joy over the last 16 years to do a lot of research to not so much connect the dates and the times and the places, because so many historians, eminent historians before me have done that. For me, it's been truly to look at it from the perspective of relationship and how those relationships, in fact, had huge impacts on the history, and how some of the history actually really truly hasn't been told because the relationships weren't truly plumbed. So that's what brought me to the title of this book. And then there's a theme that runs through the book that's called, I like to call, the capital's curious history. Because in this area, it's as interesting as the history is, it's also equally interesting, I think, the way it's told. And it can sometimes be told from a perspective that is cultural, where somebody has a distinct desire to promote the history of their own ancestors or of their own culture, whether it be linguistic, indigenous, whatever that be. And of course, I am as guilty as the next person of doing that as well. Although the more I got into the idea of presenting history, the more I realized that it behooved me to ensure that I'm always trying to make it an integral history, a history that includes all of the people who not only settled here, not only people who have been living here for millennia, but also the way that the fabric of our communities has been created by the various peoples who have not only lived here, but have become stewards of this beautiful area. The curious history brings us to some very curious stories. Some of them, of course, are featured in my blog and in the book. And I hope you get a chance to either get a copy of the book, certainly get a copy of the book, or at least read it online. But it's interesting how, and I'll give some quick examples before I get into the body of this. It's interesting how some of the history has been told and it's either lost or how it has been expanded in a direction that it was never meant to go. Now, one good example that I can give is this little white house that sits across from the Parliament buildings in Jacques Cartier Park in Hull, whose history was completely deformed, quite simply, not maliciously, but because a historian got the wrong person attached to the history. When the historian went into the history, they found, he knew that the house was locally known as Chrissy's house. And so he researched Christiana Wright. And the more he researched, the more he said, well, that's just balderdash. And it's a local myth because Christiana Wright never owned the house. The problem is he never looked farther into the genealogical record to find out that there was another Christiana who was actually Philemon's granddaughter. So what happened to that house is it deformed the history to such an extent that even the history of the settlement became deformed, quite simply by that history. So the house became known as Charon House, named after the two occupants of the house who lived in it for 2 years and couldn't pay the rent and left and went to other parts of the Outaouais. That a house should be named after two people who couldn't pay the rent is part of the curious history of the capital. It's how sometimes history gets deformed. And I'm very happy to have been able to recover the history of the house. That being said, I have made sure the NCC is going to keep the history, both histories, because they're both valuable histories. So from this time forward, the NCC will be calling it Chrissy's house or Christiana's house, as it always was, and the Charon house. So that's one example. Another example of how that happens is right nearby to where I live in Aylmer. Deschênes is a place that one local historian decided that they found a connection to the fur trade and decided to run with that and say, well, Deschênes' history is grounded in the fur trade as opposed to the timber trade, like every other place in this area. The fact of the matter is that the fur trader she found by the name of Ithamar Day arrived 19 years after the first settlers. The first settlers who built the first mill, by the way, and Deschênes' first name was Deschênes Mills. And Ithamar Day was a petty fur trader whose business only lasted 5 years, and then he left the area. So again, why somebody would want to pin the foundation myth of an area on somebody who was only there for a few years and really contributed very little to the area, when in fact you had settlers who contributed so much to their own town, is another chapter of the curious history of the capital. Not to mention a cemetery in the Aylmer area that's been locally known as the Conroy Bellevue Cemetery, but named that way by local historians. And when in fact the history is so much deeper, and I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. Even the history of Aylmer, as you'll see in what I have to say a little later on, has been also, has become something that it probably never should have been in the beginning. But anyway, apart from that, what we have in the area is, I think, if I were to go back to the beginnings of all of this, it's that every settlement and every part of this area begins at Wrightstown. Philemon Wright, of course, as you all know, is a man of a certain ability and ingenuity, and he arrived here as in an area that was uninhabited, to put it clearly, as at the time that he arrived. There were plenty of indigenous people moving through the area. There were plenty of voyageurs and fur traders moving through the area, but no one was living here. And one of the common, not fallacies, maybe errors, but also perspectives that historians have put on Philemon Wright is centers on Wrightstown. And a lot of historians have enjoyed saying that, well, Philemon Wright's town was not terribly successful because Bytown far outstripped it, and even Aylmer and Chelsea might have become more important, later on. So Philemon wasn't very successful in promoting his town. But what they failed to really understand was that the town was never a focus of Philemon Wright's. It was only a town and that was built to support the agricultural community that Philemon Wright started. The agricultural community that he started, I have to say that Joseph Bouchette, the Surveyor General of Lower Canada, a contemporary of Philemon Wright's, said that it was the most successful agricultural community in North America. So I dare say that historians could put a different slant on that and say that Philemon Wright was in fact extremely successful in doing what he set out to do. Here we go. So we're looking at Wrightstown here in about 1858. You can see that it's not terribly impressive. It's a one street, and there is his tavern here. There are his mills and foundry, and here is a grist mill, and there's a church and whatnot, but in a beautiful hotel. Apparently it was some said it was a resort. When you consider that Montreal was a fairly smelly city, people came to Wrightstown to enjoy themselves and take a little time in the country to that hotel called the Columbian Hotel. But Philemon created this town to support the farm community. And from this town, because of this capacious tavern store that Philemon created, every settlement basically came to Wrightstown to get its provisions. And not the least of which was Bytown itself, that it became created from Wrightstown. If Wrightstown had not been present, there is no way that the Rideau Canal could have been built, or even would have been built, because there had to be a place to supply all of the provisions required to build something as audacious as the Rideau Canal, which at that time was the largest engineering project in North America. So Aylmer and Richmond, they were created in 1818, Chelsea in 1819, Bytown in 1826, Wakefield and Cantley in 1830. And all of those settlements essentially depended on Wrightstown from their inception to get their start. But Philemon Wright, as I said, was absolutely about the farms. So, when we look at the Wright farms, they were created from 1800 to 1824, essentially. You can see the various farms that were created in their with their names. The Gatineau farm being the first one. Now, historians have always said, well, if the Gatineau farm was the first one created, it had to have been created by Philemon Wright, Sr. Fact of the matter is that he himself in his own report says that while he did the surveys and everything else and set up his mills in where the town would be, it was his son Philemon Wright Jr., who was 18 years old at the time when he arrived in 1800, who cleared and set up the farm in right by the Gatineau River, the Gatineau farm, which is right on, essentially, you can see down here, which is surrounded Limy Lake, and Limy Lake was a part of. So what that means, why that is significant in any way, is that when we talk about the Wrights, it's Ruggles Wright who absolutely takes a significant amount of importance in the history of the Wrights. And it's simply because he survived all of his brothers by far, by a good 20 years. So Philemon Wright Jr., who was so busy setting up the township and the farms and the town with his father, did a lot of the business, but he did not do a lot of keeping of documents, and all the clerical work was being done by another brother, Tiberius at first. So Philemon Wright and Tiberius are two, I sort of call them the lost souls of the local history, because what they actually did, what I found that they actually did and set up is monumental. And it far outstrips anything that Ruggles Wright does in setting things up. Ruggles Wright has a claim to fame, and that is, of course, setting up the first timber slide. And that is a significant achievement, to say the least. But all of the mills, the foundries, and even the timber industry were in fact started by Philemon Wright, Philemon Jr., and Tiberius. Ruggles was far too young to have anything to do with the timber industry at its inception. He was only 5 years old when he arrived here, whereas his older brothers were 18 and 15 in 1800. So you look at all of these farms. I think one significant farm that you can look at in this map that I have here is this blue farm here, which was Tiberius Wright's farm. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So all of these massive farms, Tiberius's was 800 acres. Britannia here was 1,200 acres. And then you had other farms here that were anything from 400 to 600 acres, including the farm from which Aylmer is born, the Chaudière Lake Farm, created in 1818 by Philemon Jr. So Philemon Jr. was responsible essentially for the management of the Britannia Farm, which was his, the Gatineau Farm, which again was his from the beginning, the Columbia Falls Farm and the Columbia Farm, Philemon Jr. managed at first, and he created and managed the Aylmer Farm. So Philemon Jr. plays a huge, huge role in the founding of Wrightstown, one that he never gets much credit for. But what I'd like to speak about next is the cemeteries, because every settlement obviously has to have cemeteries from its very beginnings. And what is very significant about the cemeteries is that, again, some of the history is rather curious, but also some of the history has been confused. And not the least of which was poor Thomas Wright, Philemon's brother, who dies in the first year that of the settlement. So they arrive here in 1800. Philemon and Thomas have the dream to create this agricultural community together, and unfortunately, Thomas dies in the first year, and he is buried somewhere in the early settlement. Now, you probably all know that Thomas Wright's headstone resides in the Chelsea Cemetery, but Carol Martin and Bruce Elliott and myself are of the particular opinion that the headstone tells us, first of all, that it's likely a headstone from the 1840s or 1830s. But more significantly, it is that it is, I won't say absolutely impossible, but I certainly would, and they have never said that, but they said it is most unlikely that Thomas could ever have been buried there, because Chelsea was in the wilderness, there were no roads, and there was nothing developed there in the first years of the settlement. So that he would be buried there is next to, well, is the most improbable thing that we could ever think. He was likely buried somewhere on the eastern shore of the Gatineau River, where his land was, right across from the original Gatineau farm. So although Thomas was one of the first to die, there were many who died between 1801 and 1812, when we see finally the first burial, or we know of the first burial, 1809, where the first burial occurs in this area, that when we're talking about the settlers. So I'm going to read this following passage here to give you a bit of an idea of the history. It would be very remiss of me not to acknowledge that this area has many burial grounds of First Nations people that by far predate the settler cemeteries of the city. In the city limits alone, there are 2 Indigenous cemeteries, and I'll show them here on the map. They are in green. One is right by the Museum of Civilization, and the other is in a place called Blueberry Point in Aylmer. So that's actually in Wychwood. So these are the 2 Indigenous cemeteries that I am aware of. There could be more, and I've been told by Gilbert Whiteduck that indeed there are more, but he, of course, may have knowledge, but does not divulge where they are to ensure that they remain undisturbed. So they are, of course, unmarked and should remain undisturbed if we are all to acknowledge our common spirituality and respect for our ancestors. In the city of Gatineau, the 3 oldest settlers' burial grounds that became cemeteries are the Leamy family burial ground, first known burial in 1809, the Olmsted burial ground, whose first known burial is in 1812, and the St. James Cemetery, where the first known burial is 1821. However, the problem with settler burial grounds is that the first burials may not have had a permanent marker. So given the way in which the early permanent settlements grew from Wrightstown, founded in 1800, and then along the Britannia Road and reaching to where Aylmer would develop in 1804, it is very likely that the oldest cemetery in the settlement would be found in Wrightstown. Of the 2 cemeteries there, the oldest known marker, as I said, carries the date of 1809. It's in the Leamy burial ground. The Leamy burial ground happens to be on the Gatineau farm, and it likely wasn't Andrew Leamy who was the first, he certainly wasn't the owner of that land at first. It was Philemon himself, of course, Philemon Sr., and the farm was Philemon Jr.'s. So the marker is there at 1809, has been proven to be 1809. We know of the man's name and his history, and that is also in one of the blogs on my Capital Chronicles site and in the book. So it is likely to be the oldest burial ground in the city of Gatineau at 1809, except that, as I said, there were people dying before 1809. Could it have been St. James? It certainly could have been. St. James likely received burials probably from the beginning of the settlement's history in 1800, but we have no marker before 1821. The earliest stone marker is that of Mary Polly Wright, who was actually the mother of Chrissy of Christiana's house, by the way. So she was Philemon and Abigail's oldest daughter. But the lot from the beginning was slated to become the location of the first church, if the Montreal Diocese had allowed it, which it didn't. Few historians believe that St. James Cemetery's use began with Polly's burial. Now that also explains, again, the curious history that we all know in settlements that usually there's a burial ground right beside a church. And certainly the first church, that's usually what happens. Before that, people are buried in the back 40 of the farm, or in a quiet corner of the farm, with usually wooden markers and little fences. But the reason why St. James and St. James Cemetery and St. James Church are so far apart is that the cemetery was begun there, but the diocese would not give permission for the church to be built there, curiously. So Philemon Wright donated the land in town for St. James Church, and so the church itself was built in the town proper. So that is why those two are so far apart and so unusually far apart. The other cemetery is along the Aylmer Road. And from 1802 until 1821, Bellevue Cemetery's land belonged to Philemon Wright Jr. and his wife, Sarah Olmsted, known as Sally. It is said that the first burial there, as I said, was Ann Taylor, who died in 1812. If that's the case, then the first owner of the burial ground was Philemon Jr. And it would be he that designated that to become a burial ground. Philemon Jr. was also the owner of Britannia Farm, a large farm on Britannia Road, for which the road was named. And he was the founder of the embryonic village known as Turnpike End, which later becomes Aylmer. I find that it is notable that this was with this immense contribution to the town of Aylmer, his name adorns none of those places. From 1822 until 1837, Sally's father is known to have owned the land, Gideon Olmsted. So Sally Wright likely had given the father to her husband when Philemon Jr. died. Gideon and his wife, Esther Andrews, are both buried there. At Gideon's death, the cemetery goes to William McConnell, whose daughter eventually buys the cemetery. She is the wife of Robert Conroy. So she is one of the last owners of the cemetery before the name changes to Bellevue. So historians have called it typically the Conroy Bellevue Cemetery. But as a chronicler of history, I find it, given all of the above history, all of the history that I've just recounted, historically, the cemetery should be referred to as the Wright Olmsted McConnell Conroy Cemetery, historically. But of course, its name is the Bellevue Cemetery. So again, it's another little chapter of curious history as to how history gets, I'm not going to say altered, but how it gets told locally. A few days ago, I went to this website, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's the RPGO's Sur les traces du patrimoine. And I clicked on the page because they had put that up on Facebook as please visit this site. So I visited the site and I looked through the various little capsules that they had of the history. And I encountered two capsules that I quickly called Louis-Antoine Blanchette and told him, hey, there's some history on your site that really needs updating. To which he replied that, well, the updating is scheduled for sometime in 2022, which I found curious also, quite simply, because if history is known to be outdated, I would think that a historical society would be anxious to get it changed and to ensure that the history is updated. But anyway, it usually takes me about 5 minutes to update anything on my website. But nonetheless, it will be updated in 22. So I'm going to read the following passage about it. When I clicked on the link, I was surprised. And this history certainly relates to Cantley, because most of you pass these sites on your way to work or back from work, or going into town, back from town, and you do it probably on a daily, weekly, if not daily basis. So when I clicked on the link, I was surprised to find that 2 items presented had dated or erroneous information. One was on the section about the history of the Rue Saint-Jacques in Point Gatineau, where the history of fur trader Nicolas Gatineau is repeated. And the other section was devoted to the origins of Collège Saint-Alexandre, where they say that nothing there was built before Alonzo Wright built his mansion. The history of Point Gatineau begins actually with Philemon Wright, when he surveyed the Hull Township in Templeton in 1801. Its first name was Long Point Range. So the area of Point Gatineau, and I will put up a map here again, the area of Point Gatineau, its first name came from Long Point Range. The name's quite simply given to it. Here it is right here in blue, outlined in blue, Gatineau Point. So its first name, as I said, was Long Point Range. That name evolved in French to become Longue Pointe de la Gatineau, and then shortened to Point Gatineau. The first settlers were Gideon Olmsted, Asa Townsend, and London Oxford. In 1802, the first farm was called Waterloo Farm. It was cleared by Philemon Wright, and by 1824, 120 acres had been cleared. There was a house there, there was a barn on the premises, and 4 workers lived there. So Gatineau Point was occupied, one can easily say, from 1802 on, as opposed to the history that is presented that Point Gatineau begins in 1830, and it begins with the first French-Canadian settlers who lived there. There was also a farmer who started his farm in 1806 by the name of Francois Lozeau, who started a huge farm of 200 acres that basically was just east of Greber Boulevard. So Waterloo Farm eventually becomes the property of Ruggles and Tiberius Wright, and they divided into village lots, and they renamed the lot. They renamed the farm Waterloo Village, and those lots become sold. You can see all the little houses on the riverside in the on the map here. This was originally called Waterloo Village. So when it becomes a settlement, when it goes from a settlement to a village, it goes from being Long Point Range to Waterloo Village, and then the name Long Point de Gatineau and Point Gatineau, as more and more settlers move in and more lots are sold, particularly to French Canadians, the name Point Gatineau becomes popular. In addition, what is put on the RPGO site is that myth about the Gatineau River. And I won't go into that to any great extent, but that myth has been put to bed, that it was named after a fur trader named Nicolas Gatineau. And I suggest that if you don't have my book, either to get a copy of the book, it's in there, or on the blog. And the title of that chapter or the blog is Gatineau Paddling Through the History of a River's Name. It's also on the Gatineau Valley Historical Society website. So with the new history that is there, as well as the recent archaeological digs at Place Abinane, which is what the area at Rue Jacques-Cartier has been called, the idea that there was a fur trading post there at Long Point Range can no longer be accepted as historical fact. That it still resides on so many people's historical blogs and the RPGO's website is another part of the curious history and how it's told in the Outaouais as well as the National Capital Area. As for Collège Saint-Alexandre, it is located on, and it is up here, It is located on what I pointed out earlier as Gatineau Falls, Tiberius's massive farm, which borders on Cantley. So when you go up the 303, I believe it's the 303, you pass by Collège Saint-Alexandre, and the central house in the middle of that was Alonzo Wright's farm. On the RPGO website, they say when Alonzo Wright built that house, there was nothing built. There was nothing that resided there before. There was nothing built there before, which is so far from the truth. The farm was the 5th farm cleared by the Wright family in 1811. By 1824, 800 acres had been cleared. There were 3 square timber houses, shanties, 24 workers living there. There was a sawmill, a distillery, and a very large barn, a barn that had to hold the production from that farm, which in 1823 was 400 tons of hay, 60 acres of wheat, 50 acres of potatoes, 20 acres of corn, 20 acres of peas, and 20 acres of beans and carrots. There were 125 cattle, 20 horses, 46 pigs, 50 sheep, and 2 goats living on the farm as well. So again, how the local history gets told is piecemeal. And so many of the local historians have had access to the very documents that I'm reading out here, written in the hand of Philemon Wright. And yet somehow that story doesn't get told. And some of that is because some historians are only interested in the French-Canadian history in their locality, have only been interested in telling that story, or quite simply, it was overlooked by the historian or not found, and so it doesn't get told. So as a historical society, I think there are 3 things that I will conclude on, 3 things that I'd like to finish on before I get to questions. And that is that when I talk about the curious history and the history that was never told, historical societies are doing a terrific job in making sure the history gets told. I congratulate you for your hard work on doing everything you're doing. Blackburn Cemetery and uncovering the history of that and promoting it and putting it forward and letting people know of the settler history of your own locality. So important. But I think that there is one thing that I would absolutely love to emphasize, and that is what I said at the very beginning, and that is the inclusivity of history. And when we tell the story, as I just told the story of Collège Saint-Alexandre, where we say nothing was built there before, when we know darn well there was something built, well, that shows either ignorance or exclusivity, and that can't be acceptable. Or when we see the Gatineau River having several names, but only one name being shown as its historical name, that also is exclusive and does not respect that there were thousands of people who knew the river by other names, not just the Anishinaabe name, but certainly there were Haudenosaunee and Kanien'kehá:ka First Nations who passed through and by the river, who knew it by a completely different name. And if we don't promote those names when we educate, and if we don't promote those names when we are dealing with audiences like presentations such as this, then we are really doing history injustice, and we're simply perpetuating the idea that every culture lives in a silo, which has never been the case here in the Outaouais. And certainly is not a point of view that I have ever wanted to promote. I think it also behooves us that if we are giving, if we are talking about the history, that we ensure that the names be promoted as they were first called. As in historical society, translating proper names, either from Anishinaabe to English or to French, or from French to English, I consider to be improper. I'll give you an example of the Sims Inn in my very own town, Aylmer. The Sims Inn was called the Aylmer Hotel at first. And then it became known as the Sims Inn because Charles Sims, it was his hotel, he had built it, and he was the hotel keeper. The fact of the matter is that nobody, in his family or nobody locally, called it anything but the Sims Inn. Even the French Canadians who may have stayed at the Sims Inn likely called it Sims Inn, and many of them who wrote it, they wrote it as Sims Inn. That we call it Auberge Sims today shows a lack of respect for its history, only insofar as we all know that the word inn can be translated to auberge, but it is a way of essentially erasing history that is pernicious. And the best example I can give of the erasures of history is when we look at Wrightstown itself, and you go back to historical maps and you see how so many names of roads and streets were erased and replaced with other names. And essentially, as a result of that, the names of the settlers and therefore the history becomes eroded and becomes erased. So I think it's absolutely of utmost importance that historical societies ensure that the names all be known for our localities, for our rivers, for our places, but also that when a town, a hall, a tavern, a store was founded by a French Canadian, that the first name that they gave it be used, and for the English settlers as well, so that we don't lose that history and it doesn't get eroded. And on that note, I'd like to end. And thank you very much for the attention. And I certainly will be glad to invite questions.
In one of the documents or somewhere we found when we were researching Andrew Blackburn, who was our first settler, it says that he and his two sons stopped by a house, the Wright family house, on their way. Like they were, and the Wrights reported that, you know, they would be the first settlers within 6 miles. There was one little sentence somewhere that we found with this little anecdote. So it told us so much. It told us that that was a house already on our side of the river. The east side of the river, there's very little. There's very little. Chelsea and all those places had a lot of people who were interested in history and collected things. But this side of the river was a place where farmers just were a subsistence. You know, they barely could keep their lives going, and they got farms, they got extra jobs to make ends meet, logging or doing other jobs. Anyhow, so we hang on to these little comments. And we know that Andrew Blackburn and his sons arrived here on their land in 1829. And as far as we know, they were the first. That's as far as we know, and it's pretty certain. But that one little comment in a book, so.
Well, the one little comment, actually, I think it's so colorful, because when you consider that what Andrew Blackburn is talking about is, he's talking about his neighbors. And of course, when you have a large farm, many of the farms in the area were 100 acres, 200 acre large farms. Francois Lozier had 200 acres at first, but he ended up owning about 600 or 800 acres, he and his family. So the fact is that from one neighbor to the next, you could be talking about a mile, you know, easily. Mm-hmm. So the voyage from Wrightstown up towards Blackburn's homestead must certainly have only passed by a few neighbors that we knew, of course, but just a few neighbors. And, you know, when you get those little anecdotes, when he passed by the Wrights, well, what we do know is that if Tiberius Wright's farm was going from 1811, then the fact of the matter is that there were people living on that farm, not Tiberius himself, he was living in town, but when he was in town. But nonetheless, they must have, you know, they must have known each other, and it would be interesting to know who was the farmer that was managing Tiberius's farm, something that I haven't come across. So there's that. So when you see a historical society like the RPGO who ignores the history, and says something like, well, Alonzo Wright, he was the king of the Gatineau, and he's the only important guy that we need to be concerned about or even writing about. Well, like, I'm sorry, but Alonzo Wright's, his fortune was created by those people who were living on his father's farm. The fact of the matter is that there were people who were living on his farm all along, even when Alonzo Wright was living there. You know, the little red house on Naugatuck is one of those blockhouses that was on the Tiberius Wright's farm that is mentioned in Philemon Wright's report.
Rick, that was fantastic. Great
Thank you.
presentation. Did I note on the first map that you had, did I notice a canal running from the Ottawa River below the falls to above the falls?
Let me, okay, I'm going to share that, this one right here.
Yeah,
one?
so
Yeah.
that's right. So is that,
Okay.
that's a canal then leading from below the falls to above the falls?
This is, you're seeing the timber rafts here.
Mhm.
So they are going to be broken up, the larger timber rafts into small cribs. And this is, you can see a crib actually in the timber slide. So
Ah,
this was the hull slide that was created by Ruggles Wright. So where you're looking at, just to situate you, is if you're looking at the gray stone buildings that are the E.B. Eddy buildings on Taché Boulevard,
right.
they are all here. The white derelict building right at the very center of it is essentially where the tavern store sat. It's essentially in the same footprint of the tavern store, which you see right here with the cupola on top.
Right.
So this slide, which still exists underground, partially at least, the slide began here and it ends here. And the rest of this is a channel. This was a natural channel all the way up to right at this spot. And this was what was called this is what brought voyageurs to these, the spring landing. So this was called the spring landing because it was way too dangerous to be going any further upriver with your canoes. So people would come into the inlet, voyageurs or the indigenous would come into this inlet, and from here, the first portage would begin that would go right up to Brewery Creek. So what Ruggles Wright did is he blasted this canal between the Ottawa River and this natural inlet, this natural arm of the river. And in that, he built his hull slide in 1829. So you can see one of the cribs actually in the slide right here. And this is the end of the slide right here. There's a crib, it looks like a crib is submerged. And here's a crib going down the natural arm of the river. So that's what that is that you're looking at. So this corner here would be essentially the corner of Eddy and Taché Boulevard. Here's the Elmer Road, which becomes Taché Boulevard, of course, the Elmer Road. And this is what was then known as the Common of Wrightstown, this whole area. Does that answer your question, Pierre?
It certainly does. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Merci, Rick, pour la super présentation. C'est super intéressant. J'ai appris plein de choses. Puis, je suis
Merci bien.
contente d'apprendre. Puis, je suis votre blog depuis que vous l'avez commencé. Puis, nous autres, dans le groupe, on adore lire ça. On apprend beaucoup. Puis, ma question...
Merci, vous êtes bien gentil.
Merci. La question que j'ai, c'est, je remarque dans votre blog que vous avez des super bonnes sources. Souvent, comme je dis, c'est des primary sources. Puis, moi, je me demande, c'est quels vos dépôts d'archives ou vos sources, où est-ce que vous les trouvez? C'est ça que j'aimerais savoir.
Principalement, c'est les archives, les fonds, Wright, du Bibliothèque et Archives Canada. Alors, il y a ça. Il y a l'excellente archive du Gatineau Valley Historical Society, les archives des papiers Wright aussi. Et puis, ça, c'est les sources primaires. Alors, ce que moi, j'ai toujours voulu faire, c'est en lisant ce que les autres historiens ont écrit, c'est définitivement important et ça te pointe dans la direction souvent exactement de ce que tu veux. Mais si tu te bases complètement sur les données de l'historien, tu pourrais tout simplement répéter une gaffe que l'historien lui-même ou elle-même a fait. Alors, c'est pour ça que quand je vois une histoire complète, déjà écrite par un historien, et puis il y a une partie que je veux soit élaborée ou je veux plomber un petit peu plus près, je vais toujours aller chercher les références, surtout les sources primaires, si je peux, et puis je vais toujours aller dans les écritures des Wright pour voir que ça n'a pas été confondu. Parce que la main de Philemon Wright, une fois que Philemon a à peu près 65 ans, sa main droite est écrasée dans un accident sur sa ferme. Et son écriture devient très difficile. Pire que ça, son fils, Philemon Jr., a une écriture terrible. Ça m'a pris un document tout seul, là, une fois, ça m'a pris 2 semaines à pouvoir défricher 3 pages d'écriture. C'est très, très, très difficile. Alors, c'est pour ça que souvent, les historiens, je ne dirais pas qu'ils sont paresseux, là, mais ils vont se servir des écritures des autres historiens. Malheureusement, peux-tu continuer en anglais, Valérie?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So this is one thing that I think also everybody will be interested in, and that is that local historians are very incestuous, I have found, particularly the more recent local historians, where they seem to feed on each other's writings and each other's research. And what happens is that history gets sometimes very distorted as a result. Not all local historians, and I certainly don't want to tar everybody with the same brush. Alors, qu'est-ce qui se passe tout simplement, c'est que en prenant les écritures d'un autre historien et sans avoir vérifié les sources, tu peux facilement être induit en erreur. Puis ça, c'est toujours ce que j'ai cherché à éviter. Et puis, c'est ce qui m'a toujours amené aussi à l'histoire curieuse de la quête femme. Parce que des fois, il y a des faits historiques qui sont, comment pourrais-je dire, ben, si on utilise Benjamin Sulte, par exemple, qui sont plutôt un mythe, une légende, une histoire racontée et non pas basée sur des faits historiques. Et puis, si quelqu'un décide de ne pas aller aux sources et se base sur l'histoire de Benjamin Sulte, se disant que ben, c'est un historien, ça doit être bon, en fait, tu peux manquer une grande partie de l'histoire. Alors, il y a ça principalement, les sources secondaires, évidemment, sont toutes en famille. Alors, moi, par exemple, I'll give a good example. My Aunt Liza lived to be 105 years old. She was Andrew Leamy's daughter-in-law, not granddaughter-in-law. She was Andrew Leamy's daughter-in-law. And she lived in Andrew Leamy's house. And I sat at the foot of Liza, so like many years and for many dinners, listening to the stories of the Leamy family. So the fact of the matter is, when the archaeologists were digging in the Leamy farm, I wasn't aware they were doing it. My father was a family historian. He wasn't aware either. So they didn't know, they were looking for Philemon Wright's first home and second home. So they didn't know exactly what they were looking at when they were digging up the foundations and everything else. But we could have told them because we had it all written down in the family Bible. But they didn't ask. So there you have it.
Merci, Rick, des très bons conseils.
Merci.
You've given us lots to think about, and you've encouraged us enormously. And it's very special that you are here at our meeting today. Thank you so much, Rick.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and I hope to have a second kick at the can sometime.
Oh, we'd love that.
And then in person.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.